So here, this first slide I was talking about, Aaron, what's really kind of cool about it is there's a lot of misconceptions that kind of go into transition when we're talking about getting ready, and especially when it comes down to employment. So we always love teaching and thinking about the business's perspective. So what we're going to start off here and build a slide is a concept that maybe a lot of you haven't heard of, because it's been being driven by a very uncertain business environment. So we'll go into that deeper in other single topic videos, but it's a really uncertain business environment. They have to actually make money before they spend it, which means they actually have to be really rigid in their processes. And one of their processes they do is they actually have to establish what they call a headcount. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, a headcount is the maximum number of employees, full-time employees, that a business has in order to be able to run its business. Now, the business is defined as a very specific set of criteria. It's delivering programs and services to the customer, and you can't have too many people in the business that are doing that, or it's going to be excess cost. So the way I like to think about that is think about it just like it's visually drawn here as a box. So this is the box that the business must work within with the full-time number of employees that it has to execute the business. What do you think of that, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And just to pause and rewind a little bit, I mean, just looking at this first question, what companies are looking for in talent and why? I don't know that a lot of folks in the military that are getting out right now are even asking that question. They're looking for a job, but they're not necessarily transferring their mindset into the mindset of the future employer that they're looking at going to. But if they can do that, it will be super helpful for them to understand and to probably get the job, because they're going to understand the business a little better, and they're going to understand how that role fits into the business making money. And I think that's what we're getting to here. But headcount is super important to understand, especially you skill bridgers. As you go into your internships, please ask the question, is there an approved headcount for this role, for this internship, associated with this internship? So that you know, hey, am I heading into an opportunity where there's a potential job at the end? Or is this just an internship where you get some experience and then move along? So it's super important to understand.
It is. And definitely, if you haven't, to kind of add a little bit more to what Aaron was saying, which is perfect for the skill bridge, the other part of headcount is just simply understand that's a limitation of the business, right? And what I hear from a lot of folks in the military is, hey, I got a buddy who's an admiral or a general, and they're holding a job for me. And whenever you hear that, some red flags ought to go up where you go, I don't know about that, right? Because it's not like the other thing that's really important to understand about headcount is once it's set, it's actually set. They do not change headcount unless there's a tremendous change in the business, how it operates, a new market they're going into, or a new product that they want to deliver and they need additional headcount. That is pretty much constrained. So when you or a friend of yours or think about it, or you hear someone say, hey, they're holding a position for me, that is a really big red flag. You got to be worried about that. So we'll move into
job offer?
What's that?
Would you call that a job offer?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
So yeah, so if there's a role open and it happens to be open, it's been open a long time, there's something going on there. But someone who's a friend of yours that says, hey, we've got a role open for you, and you're 2 years out, is not a job offer. That is just someone that is not understanding how a business is formed, how it's organized, which is what we're going to get into right now. The next thing within the box, right? So the full number of full-time employees that they could have to run the business is what I call the loaf of bread, right? So we divide this up in two different ways. I use a loaf of bread because honestly, it's a great analogy. So this represents the roles that are available within the company. So the roles, this is really different for a military person who brings a military mindset into this conversation. The reason why I pick bread is because they are actually looking for a very credentialed specialist to do a very specific job within the business. So think about each one of those slices of bread as being different, as being a really different specific role within the business that requires specific experience and credentialing. And then you can see together, they're brought together like a loaf of bread in the aggregate, and then taken to the market and as a system work together. So had you heard of the bread analogy before, Aaron?
No, that's a new one for me. I mean, I like it. It makes sense that, hey, all these components kind of make up the whole, which I guess you'd have to decide, is that whole loaf, is that a program, or is that the business, or is that a business unit? We're getting into a whole bunch of other terms here, but what's important is that the roles all work together and are all necessary for the operations of that company. And they are different and individual in their nature.
That's exactly right. Now, that's one way, one piece of the half, right? So you need the right people is the best way to say that. Now, the next thing we talk about within the business is this. So this is the levels. So where one was divided up kind of like on a vertical nature, this one's divided up on a horizontal nature, going from, the least experience to the highest experience. And we call this levels. So as you can see from the bottom, it starts off with entry level individual contributor, then goes to experience, senior individual contributor, and then director, vice president, GM. And you can see the little asterisk there that indicates that anything typically in companies above director level is considered executive. So why this is profound is because you need the right people on one hand, which is the roles, but you also need the right levels, which means you need a good mix of maturity within the company. If you have too many people that are too young, a lot of times they're not going to understand the programs or the products and services that the company typically delivers, the legacy part of the business. And if you have folks that are too old within the organization, been there too long, they'll lack the innovation that younger people can bring in. So from a organizational standpoint, it's really important to understand that businesses want the right people, the roles, and then they want a good mix of the older folks and the younger folks to make sure that there's good succession planning should people retire, move out to different jobs, move away to different companies. So I think that's a really good, simple way to look at it, whether you're looking at, roles or a loaf of bread, and the different levels, the way we divide them up from least experience to most experience.
Now, I think an important point and something I didn't understand for a long time was with these levels, is this based on leadership and ability, or is this based on specific experience in that industry or company? I mean, what defines that up arrow there? Because if I'm, retiring colonel or something, does that mean I can just pop over to that director slot, or what is the deal?
That is an outstanding question. So we will be covering this in other lessons, but we talk frequently, at least in the pre-veteran ecosystem, about the big differences between the military ecosystem and the private sector workforce, which there's a lot. So even though you do have a lot of experience coming out of the military, that experience does not have the business acumen that folks would that are coming in the private sector have been in that a long time. So imagine looking at it in reverse, and I hear this used effectively all the time. Get a 40-year-old guy, right, that's in the private sector workforce, bring him in and have him run a company or a flight or a squadron in the military. Not going to happen, right? I mean, you can hear about this all the time in the dentist corps, actually, where you get folks who, all of a sudden go, hey, I want to be in the Air Force or the Army. They go in to become a dentist. They want to serve, which is wonderful. And then they go into the military organization and they struggle mightily because it is so different. Well, obviously, it's the reverse of that. Now, something else we will talk about in subsequent videos is the actual real value of going into an organization as an individual contributor. It's a great way to get your feet wet with the business, understand how it works, understand how it's organized, understand how that role aids the profit-making enterprise, which are all big gaps coming out of the military. But to your point exactly, Aaron, when you talk about this has very little to do with what you did in the military. It's more along the lines of, because the business needs to function and the business has a certain way of doing things. And that's another gap that we're going to bring to light, is just the gap in the knowledge of understanding how businesses function outside of the private sector, or outside of the military and in the private sector.
So another big question I had, because I want to make, thinking through my transition, I wanted to make good money. I wanted it to do well. So if I'm looking at the entry level individual contributor, doesn't that mean I'm kind of hamstringing myself, like, hey, I'm just going to stay in this low salary range? I mean,
yeah, another great question. So the way I would address that is it's highly industry specific. So there's going to be different industries out there, and I can tell you from a personal standpoint, for aerospace defense, let's say, even entry level individual contributors can make a very well paying salary in that industry. I think tech is the same. I think logistics is very similar. Outside of that, it is going to be variable, but you certainly can do well into the six figures if you're in an entry-level individual contributor in some industries. That's going to require the process on your part where you're going out, reaching out to subject matter experts, making sure you understand what salary bands they are, which, by the way, correspond to each one of these levels. So once you get more familiar in our ecosystem and within our community, it's really becomes very easy to understand exactly what you're heading into.
that makes
All right. So, hey, guess what, Aaron? I want to show you that because you talked about mindset there for a minute. So we're going to roll into the next slide. And even though this is pretty well known outside of the military in the industry that there's roles and levels to make sure that the business is being taken care of, we're going to show you what you're up against as a military person as you're leaving the military. We talk about this a lot in pre-veteran, but you approach the transition as what we call an ignorant hubris. We do that with a little bit of humor, but what we're really saying is that you haven't been in the private sector before, so you have what we call the brain gap, right? There's no long-term memory to draw from in order to understand what the private sector is about. Today, we're going to leave that one and table it for another discussion. What we're really talking about here is the hubris piece, which is the military mindset heuristic, where those judgments, those decisions that usually pop into your mind because you've done them so many times in the military, you'll try to apply that to the private sector and it becomes problematic. So let me build out what those are. So because of your time in the military, you will have this heuristic, which is essentially a shortcut in your mind that is going to tell you that you can figure this out on your own, this transition piece. Now, this becomes problematic in your first job, in SkillBridge and anything else, because you frankly don't want to tell your boss that you're unsure of what the private sector is and how it functions. The next one is definitely the most pernicious, though. It's the private sector wants a generalist. So for a former Navy guy like you, Aaron, it was rates. For Air Force, it was AFSC. For the Army and Marine Corps folks, it's an MOS, primary and secondary. But what you end up doing in the military is just being a good military man or woman. You do what the unit needs outside of your primary. So what happens is you've done so many cognitive iterations in that cycle, your brain will tell you that you want and should be a generalist, because that's what you've done for the last 4 or 40 years. So it's very natural that your brain, in a very large and booming voice, will tell you, the private sector wants a generalist also, someone that can do multiple things. And we showed you in the previous slide that is simply not the case. They're looking
I think the perfect example of this, sorry to interrupt, but like during TAP class, they had me do kind of a general resume, and on there I was putting all the things I'd done, right? I was like, I had been an air operations director. I ran an aircraft maintenance department. I had done, air operations, the director for that, and I'd run the tactics department. So you start just putting all these things on there that are totally unrelated and disparate. They're all over the place, right? It's and it doesn't paint a clear picture of anything. It's just like a bunch of random things in a box that you're trying to push towards someone. Like, see here, I've done a bunch of stuff. And it really just shows that you're a generalist, that you're kind of a jack of all trades. But they're like, okay, but I have a specific slice of bread I'm trying to accomplish here. I have this very specific slice of bread I'm trying to get someone placed within, because we need to complete our loaf here. And instead, we're handing them a loaf of bread going, see, look at this.
I do everything. I'm the Swiss Army knife. I can do it all.
It's crazy.
It is crazy, but this is interesting, because this is where we get into the civil military divide, right? Where you talk about, hey, the private sector doesn't understand us. Hey, and then the private sector's like, wow, I don't, someone's handing me this resume that Aaron just talked about. And you're like, so what do you want to do? Right? I mean, they're trying to find the specific slice of bread. You're trying to tell them, the generalist that you are, thinking that they value that. That is the civil military divide. And that's something that we call a misalignment. And it's a big misalignment. And this is where we put in the plug for our programs, right? So what we do is we hold a employment prep course 3 times a year. It's in February, June, and October typically. And this is what we really do, is address this mindset issue and alignment to the private sector. And this is where we really begin to iron out and get you ready for post-military employment, because we deal with the brain gap here, the mindset heuristic. And then we do teach you about what the private sector values at a much, much deeper level. And then once you finish that course, you actually go into our community where you get a bunch of additional training. And what we really want you to do is be able to be fully prepared from an employment standpoint, from all the different things you need to do, from a VA claim to getting insurance if you need it, to making sure, that you're getting some intermediate additional training to make sure that you're really turning on what needs to be a completely different mindset as you head out into the private business world. So we're going to use that as a get ready to wrap up on the final slides here. So here, after listening to that, you're probably going to guess what's on this slide already. But as I build this out, what are companies really looking for in talent, and why? It's very simple. They're looking for a service member that is credentialed, right? Think of the slice of bread. They need to be credentialed. They need to have specific skills meeting the business's needs. And then finally, and absolutely for sure, the business world does not need a generalist, because they don't know where to put you. And we told you about headcount, right? This is the headcount is the box they work in, and they have roles and levels, which means each role has to be really specific, which means someone that comes to them with a generalist mindset is really going to be a bit of an enigma or anomaly to them, and it's not going to quite work. So actually the work is on you to go out there and make sure that you come up with, what are you going to be as a specialist? How are you going to get credentialed? And we can help you with that at Pre-Veteran. We'd love to have you in our next course.
And I know that for me, when I went through the course as a student, what it helped me do was, and what the goal is of our course still, is to identify down to the industry, company, role, and level, like we just kind of outlined. And if you can do that, we can teach you how to get that role, right? And that makes sense to you, that if you're looking at a role, you can find a way to that role. But if you're just looking at transition in general, or you just generalize, hey, I'm going to be a program manager, there's no real path there. Show me a specific role and I can help you get there. And we help you get to the point of identifying that. So that's huge.
Absolutely perfectly stated. And we're trying to keep it short just because we know that people don't have much time to listen in. So we hope you really enjoyed this latest discussion of what companies are looking for in talent and why. If you'd like to get a hold of us, we'll have it down in the YouTube comments below of where you could find the Pre-Veteran website, right? And then we'd love to hear if you have any comments or questions. We'll get those answered to you. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next video.
See you guys next time.